Mists is one that I am most unsure exactly how that's going to play out.
Why do you say that?
It's kind of hard for me to figure out, like, how much is it going to be a case of tyrannical without prideful, making those bosses take like a really long time and not be feasible, versus is that going to be possible? And the question to me also is, like, is bolstering going to throw a big wrench into strategies involving pulling multiple packs in the maze? Because often they come in at disparate health amounts that would make a bolstering problem. So I'm curious to see what ends up happening with that.
Yeah. That's a really good point. We're going to be looking at game number 1. I love this logo design, by the way, for 4 Danes, 1 Swede, getting in the flag colors and everything as well. Let's see what these two teams have in store. As complexity, top of our bracket here, 4 Danes, 1 Swede, the lowest seed for our bracket. Let's get it going in game number 1 in Mystic TIRNA SCITHE.
Ooh, the Resto Druid on JB here for complexity. Very interesting. I think this is the first time that we actually see a Resto Druid in this season 2 of the MDI here in Shadowlands. Last weekend we didn't have a Resto Druid at all, so very interesting. We also see the Prod Warrior as well, so it's a very physical, damage-heavy group for complexity, while 4 Danes, 1 Swede is going a little bit of a mix. We have the Demon Hunter for the magic buff for the Fire Mage, and then we also have the Windwalker and the Hunter for the physical damage. All right, so it looks like they also have like a pretty different strategy as well. I guess it makes sense because of the bolstering affix, right? Bolstering, of course, does not allow you to do that same pull that we saw last weekend, where they would pull basically everything together. They had these 2 high HP mobs that Complexity is fighting now, plus the Trash Group, plus also the Tormentor mob as well. But obviously that's not something you can do anymore with that bolstering affix. So we do see a little bit of a different strat. Complexity already dealt with 11% trash on their first pull, and now they're moving on. So seeing a lot of the trash in front of this Night Fae gate, then opening up the gate, and while they collect their mushrooms, they're fighting these 2 high HP mobs. 4 Danes, 1 Swede are now also at the same point in the dungeon, but their first pull was quite a lot smaller. As you can see, they're only up to 6% trash.
And one of the things you can see as well is I think some of them have actually not clicked their mushroom as well, so that they can take advantage of that 300% field with Furious Thrashings. And then once that set of Furious Thrashing goes off, then they're going to pull it into the trash to not have to worry about that extra AoE damage. And on top of that, the other important thing about getting those Bowbreakers low is they're making sure they're not bolstering anything too much. It's going to be similar HP. They can pop the cooldowns, clear everything down at the same time. Very efficient way for them to do extra AoE. Now, one of the reasons we're seeing this Resto Druid, the tech was found out. People were curious, why was JB playing it? Exactly, he's playing a Kyrian Druid. He's buffing that monk with the Kyrian empowerment every single 1 minute, which is when that Bone Dust Brew combo damage is up. So he's just pretty much buffing the monk every single time he does a lot of burst damage, and it actually ends up being a lot of damage over the course of the dungeon.
Is he also playing the Kyrian Legendary? Because I do believe the way that works is...
yeah, I think so.
I do believe the way the Kyrian Legendary works for Resto Druid as well is that the person that you're bonding to, because that's the Kyrian Covenant ability for Druids, you're bonding to a player, right? And while you're bonded, usually nothing happens. It only does something when you activate the bond every 1 minute. But with the Legendary, you actually constantly give your bonded person a buff. And I believe it's dependent on the covenant that the person is. So it's giving one of the stats depending on which covenant you're bonding to. I'm not sure which stat Necrolord would give in this case if he's bonding to the Windwalker.
Yeah, and now the thing is, they were buffing the Windwalker for damage. We were talking about this for the other side in Time Trials, but if I'm not mistaken, it looks like he's buffing the Rogue here for pure single target damage.
Oh.
So, yeah, just making sure they get as much single target damage off. And here's the burn on them for Ingram Malik, and they're going to easily get it low enough to one-phase it. Getting it down to 10% is plenty to just go off the phase. And that's not too surprising, I feel like. Last week we saw teams get it to this level on 21 Tyrannical, so being able to do that on 19 Tyrannical works as well.
Yeah, and one thing to note as well is that JB did a lot of damage on his Resto Druid as well. He did 12k DPS on this boss, which of course is probably not as high as like a Paladin would do with Ashen Hollow, but it's on a 4-minute cooldown, right? If JB can do this much damage without a 4-minute cooldown, then that's going to be very valuable. So we'll see how he's going to do on other trash packs as well. So now they're moving on. Looks like Danes and 1 Swede did not quite manage to get the boss Dungeon 1 phase, so they're gonna have to do the Droman again. But they also pulled Oros on top of this boss. So they're dealing with one of the Tormentor mobs while also dealing with the boss, which is very dangerous because you're slowed by 50%, have to dodge all the swirlies, additionally the ones from the boss as well, and you have to dodge the frontal too. So lots of walking happening, especially when the fear comes out. And you can see Herudra actually going down on that Windwalker. They do have a Valorous available, but they have to use that Engineering Rest because they don't have a class that actually has that. And yeah, interesting and difficult pull as their Hunter goes down too, trying to get the Windwalker back up. This might be a little bit of a disaster because Droman is on 50% only, and the boss is already doing so much damage to the whole group. I'm not sure if they're going to be able to recover.
Well, you know what the problem is as well, is this is a big problem with push keys last season that you saw. Paladins had to pop their cooldowns to deal with the Prideful. They didn't have cooldowns to heal through the second phase, and I mean, just getting a second phase is a problem alone because we saw that Complexity was able to one phase it, and yeah, like you said, this is just going to be a disaster. This is for sure going to be a full team wipe here, as they're going to have all of their DPS go down, only the tank left alive, and there's no way he's going to be able to solo the last 30% of the boss here, unfortunately. Going to be a full team wipe for 4 Danes, 1 Swede. But on the other side, we see Complexity trucking ahead through that maze now. I believe they're in their 3rd room, and even with that bolstering affix, making sure to pull as much through walls as possible.
Yeah, that's what Ratno said earlier, that he's going to be interested to see Mist, is also my sentiment as well. Because I was thinking this might actually be one of the most difficult dungeons for the teams to optimize this weekend. Because it is a lower key, so one facing the first boss should theoretically not be super difficult for those teams, right? We saw Complexity have a pretty easy time. 4 Danes, 1 Swede, they just struggled because they had the Tormentor, right? So I do think if you're not pulling any sort of Tormentors on top, then the one facing should be pretty easily doable, and then you can focus on dungeon speed in the rest of the dungeon, but you have bolstering, right? And it's only a 19, and usually when it's a 19, then the teams try to pull so many things on top of each other because they can, right? It's whenever something is possible, they are going to go for it. So they try to do those incredibly risky pulls, but with bolstering, it's going to be very interesting in how the teams are going to handle it. And it looks like Complexity is doing an incredibly good job. If there's a high HP target, they're getting it a little bit low first, and then they're pulling stuff on top of it. Like the Matriarch, for example, was dropping pretty low. Now they have the other trash on top that got pulled through the wall here. And they also have a lot of single target priority damage by the Rogue. So the Rogue is evening out that damage while the other two can AoE.
Man, JB is actually just spreading the love around. Every single time someone in his group comes out, he's swapping his empowerment and giving it to them. Last pull, I saw him give it to Shaq on the Monk there. This pull, Fired Up had True Shot up, so he empowered with Fired Up and gave him the buff. He's just really making... I mean, this is actually a pretty interesting playstyle. I mean, you have to get a lot of value out of it if you're like actually putting your empowerment on a cooldown every single time, right?
I think so as well. I think this might actually be something that maybe other teams didn't necessarily consider this too much, because one thing with that Kyrian bond is that the value of it cannot easily be seen when you look at like the locks afterwards, right? Because it buffs the player's damage, it gives him more like stats. So it's going to increase their damage, but you can't necessarily tell how much damage it gave them, right? If you look at a Paladin's damage, you can clearly see the DPS of how much the Paladin did. But the value of a Rasta Druid with that bond, maybe it's not that easy to actually figure out. And maybe that's going to be something that other teams are going to adapt to as well.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. So the legendary he's using, it just gives them a flat amount of a stat. I think it's 8% of a stat depending on your covenant. So for instance, if he gives it to the rogue on single target here, he'll be giving them 8% crit. But while the empowerment is actually buffed that double, so he's getting 16% crit plus the baseline, I believe 10% of the damage they deal during those 10 seconds, right? So, I mean, that's actually like a lot of damage every minute, right?
I'm not sure if the damage also, like the stats definitely work like that, but I'm not sure if the damage works because he's a healer, and I think like it works with like Munkin bond that way. But I'm not sure if it works the same way with the healer bond. It might just give them. Yeah, actually, I'm not sure. I haven't looked into Kyrian Rasta Druid a lot myself. We're gonna have to ask JB about this one, I think.
Or maybe one of our healers that we have on broadcast with us this weekend can help us out with that later on.
Maybe.
Maybe. I mean, I'm actually interested. I want to look up how it works right now because I only know how the Boomkin one works. I would assume it would work the same way.
Yeah, I also only know
it's
that
based
one as
off
well.
of the person you put it on, I believe. But yeah. I'd
Oh
love to
yeah,
see a
okay.
breakdown.
I think I remember now. So the way it works is that when you activate the bond, then like 20% of all damage you do gets like put into like a pool, basically, that the bonded person receives, and then that pool can be used up by three things. Either if you take damage, it's going to give you like an absorb, like 20% of the damage is going to be absorbed. Each hit is going to count individually, and if you do damage, then it's going to take 20% of the damage you do is going to be added to the damage as well. And then I think it's also healing. So if you're healing, then it's going to add 20% of that pool that you have on top of the heal that you do, right? But the problem is with the damage, it's going to be hard for JB to actually consume the pool that the damage dealer is giving him, because he's not going to be able to do that much damage, right? It has basically a cap. The hard cap is 20% of the damage that you deal within those 10 seconds, which is not going to be a lot from a Restored, right? But and JB himself also is not going to have a huge pool that he gives to that person. So it's definitely going to be like a bigger damage increase for a Moonkin, right? But it's still going to be working pretty well for a Restored as well.
I mean, he's definitely not doing nothing though. Like he's pretty much keeping up
it's
with the
definitely
tank,
good, yeah.
which is like, I mean, usually we see Holy Paladins right above tanks, not right below tanks for like boss pools, I guess. So, I mean, he's definitely doing good damage for a healer that's not a Holy Paladin, right?
Yeah, definitely. And then you, of course, have to think about the damage he's adding onto the damage dealer. If you would account that damage to himself, then he might be beating a Paladin's damage, right? So I do think this is a very interesting strat. But we talked so much about the Restored. I mean, it is exciting, right? Because this is the first time we've seen a Restored in forever. So definitely can't blame us for focusing on that much. But Complexity is now already done with that second boss, as they're now moving on to some of these trash pools. They're already up to 85% trash. So there's very little trash they still have left to do. And look at the time. I mean, it's 11 minutes into the dungeon, and they're already about to reach the last boss. Last weekend, we had Mists. It was tyrannical as well last weekend, but it was a 21. And the fastest Mists we've seen last week was from Perplexed, and it was a 14 minutes and 48 clear. And Complexity definitely looks like it's going to be faster.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, 19 bolstering is probably pretty comparable to 21 non-bolstering, right? I mean, I guess the bosses are going to take a little bit extra time because of the extra key level, but I would say it's probably pretty close, if not maybe like 30 seconds faster, just because of the key level. But I mean, yeah, this is still just a blazing fast dungeon in general. The only real like thing you can't do in this key compared to the 21 that we saw last week was you can't pull your final trash pack on top of the boss up, unless you pull it like at the last 20%, which is something we saw in the Necrotic Wakes last week. So all things considered, it's hard to compare to last week, but when you see that they have a 0-death run, they're playing perfectly, things are dying without getting too bolstered. I mean, these guys look completely practiced. It's like they haven't really lost a step compared to where they were at the end of last season after having to get attuned to their new tank and kind of work their way back up the ladder.
Yeah, I think they're having an incredibly good showing here in that very first dungeon. Super clean run, as they're just dealing with Tredova. They still have the 2% trash on the board, which they're probably going to be pulling, or they could theoretically be pulling on top of the boss at the very end. And then we also see that they dealt with 2 Tormentor mobs. Now, if it's a tyrannical dungeon, we see teams mostly do this. It's really difficult to keep up a, like to have 3 Tormentor buffs or debuffs at the end, right? If it's tyrannical, because then it just lasts so long, and if you have like a 50% healing debuff, that's so difficult to deal with. So that's why we don't only see the 2. As they now finish off Tredova, they need only that 2%, so they're killing some larvae off of this last trash pack. And what a clean run. They're going to be winning this first dungeon against 4 Danes, 1 Swede with a 13 minutes 38 clear.
There it is, last bit of trash percentage going down for Complexity as they show up with a strong run there. Very clean, so them taking the win, game number 1 here in Mist, Stratnos.
Yeah, impressive impressive performance in this bolstering dungeon as well. I think well played and a good showing that Complexity have, they've showed up to play here today. This is a pretty fast run. I think it'll be exciting to see if other teams are going to be able to match this time as well.
That's right. And, when we have our first seed going up against our lowest seed and everything like that, one of the biggest things we want to be looking for from Complexity side as well, Nagur, is how clean are they performing? Are they having any deaths? Are they having any mistakes that are eating up some extra time here? Because a lot of respects, they also got to be, kind of playing against themselves and preparing for these future later matches.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Zyra was talking about as well, that the last season, they, it took them a while to get into it, and maybe they weren't synergizing that well together with the new players that they had, with the tank replacement. But now Scott coming in and being that, main tank from Limit, it seems like they're really just hit it off in the first dungeon. Of course, it's only one sample size that we've seen. It could be different later on as well, but it's definitely it's good for their motivation as well to see that the very first dungeon they're doing went so well.
Yeah, that's right. And, Dreadnoughts, you were talking about some of the variety before the match as well when we start getting into some of the highlights of just how this would be a lot different than last week. And, when we look at Complexity, they were just rolling on through.
Yeah, not too much you can do different in this dungeon, but I wanted to highlight this thing that Zyra actually mentioned during the broadcast, which I think is really good and you can use in your live keys, is during the tantrums of these bow breakers, if you pull them into that room, you can eat the mushrooms during that thrash and heal yourself up to full. Really good call out, actually, that I think is something that, especially in higher keys, can be a huge amount of effective healing. And look at the way that they manage their bolstering in the middle of this maze. Not to mention that stuff is kind of funneling in, being pulled at weird times, but also every other mob except for that dragon has way less health. So it's really good that Lip there on that sub-rogue is just focus targeting down that high health target. That's really important in the bolstering affix. Then, of course, good management on this last boss. You can see the way that they have two of their melee, Scott and Lip, right, kind of stacking on top of each other. That's a really good strategy if you have a lot of melee to minimize the dead space near the boss. Is to just kind of overlap, right? You stand on top of each other, and then it does make it a little bit harder for you to dodge, but it means there will be a lot less green on the ground afterwards.
That's right. And, we're not having any sort of race cars going all over the place or anything like that. I mean, Dranos, ever had any experience with some race cars there? Trying to take out your DPS?
Oh, I do. So anytime I'm doing this key, and it's not a super important key or 2 minutes away from depleting or timing it, I'm always trying to create a race car. But as soon as that ability goes out, I'm Soul Shape Heroic Leap. I'm just trying to create one that I will be able to snipe somebody with from downtown.
Oh my goodness, monster. Yeah. Well, with that victory, that is going to start setting our sights up on a 22. And before we got into that miss, Zyra, we were talking about big shifts in key levels for these teams and how they need to be able to prepare for them.
Yeah, and I mean, miss kind of makes a little bit of sense, right? There wasn't too much different that you could pull in that dungeon just because of the nature of the maze. And honestly, Theater of Pain, I think it's going to be pretty similar to last week as well. 21 to 22 is not too big of a difference. You just have to have more cooldowns allocated for the more difficult pulls. Things that I think are going to be a little more difficult on this level that we'll have to really keep an eye on are things like the first pull in the Gore Chop wing, as well as that one pull where you pull Incinerator on top of one of the Soulstorm ads as well, on top of 6 of the Shackled Souls. I'm not sure if that pull's going to work out, especially on Inspiring.
That's right.
That's going to be scary to look at. There's a lot of scary pulls, and not to mention the affixes as well really don't lend themselves for big pulls either. Inspiring, meaning you can't CC things unless you just CC and move out the inspired mobs. And then once people start ticking down, you also have Grievous to worry about as well. It's a pretty difficult affix combination to deal with for big pulls.
That's right. And, we've seen a number of, very tight and very challenging pulls. People trying to pull extra mobs onto, the Executor, for example, Nagura last week, and just having to deal with, the healing debuff. And you also mentioned, like you said, the Incinerator going to be on top of that. But we also got to see a lot of teams using some special tech to get Gourd Shop pulled and drag the entire party with them to be able to get a lot of trash done with the boss.
Yeah, I think it's very possible that we're going to see something like that again, because the affixes don't really prevent you from doing that. You have the Inspiring and Grievous, which I'm not sure if one of the mobs before Gourd Chop, one of the two, the Butcher, is inspired, because if one of them is inspired, that might be a problem. But otherwise, they might be able to do that same pull where you basically just have the hunter or the mage is stealthing all the way through to Gore Chop, and then they pull the boss, use an immunity to not die until the grip gets casted by Gore Chop, and they actually get gripped from upstairs through the floor into the boss room, which allows those teams to skip a lot of the trash that is usually just very inefficient to deal with. And yeah, I'm interested to see if we're going to see something similar again by this group here as well.
Yeah, and just being able to build onto last week's strategies and start figuring out how people can kind of optimize. Although it is kind of important to note as well, our number 1 seed from last week, Dratnos, didn't use that strategy at all in Theater, and they were still extremely quick.
Yeah, when you think about strats like that, it is this case of like, does this even save time? Is a question that, maybe just really efficiently pulling normally can do even faster, right? So maybe it's a case of like, if you're really good, you actually don't even save time by doing some kind of fancy skip like that. And the other factor that you have to consider is how much risk am I incurring in my dungeon by doing this, right? Like, am I comfortable with, say, a 20% chance of losing 5 minutes here to gain 30 seconds another 80% of the time? That question is actually really hard to answer, and it depends a lot on like what sort of competition you're expecting, right? How much you feel like you're going to need those 30 seconds to win the crucial matches in your bracket. And I think for a lot of teams, the answer is actually probably, hey, let's take this more safe strategy. If they can actually make it safe to fight those trash mobs au naturel, which maybe not. Those trash mobs are pretty rough.
That's right. Like we already mentioned, those affixes having to worry about the inspiring. And, we've seen time and time again how much damage can be stacking up onto the tanks, how much pressure there's going to be in some of these pulls. Because, Theater's not some dungeon that really lends itself to be able to easily corral massive amounts of mobs in every single wing. You have to be very creative with how you're putting these things together. And that also means taking a lot of extra risk. I mean, we saw, for example, teams skipping one of the Tormentors from our seasonal affix while they're fighting Zav, and the risks of pulling that if they're not properly positioning themselves. So the extra risks, the extra strategies these teams have to entail for something like MDI are just always so dangerous. So let's see what 4 Danes, 1 Swede, and Complexity have in store for us as Theater of Pain gets rolling.
All right, so again, same composition actually out of Complexity with the Dresser Druid again. So it wasn't just a Mists of TIRNA side thing. They just decided to run it in this dungeon as well, and maybe in a lot of dungeons afterwards too, as they are doing a boss pull with all of the trash as well on Complexity sides. 4 Danes, 1 Swede on the other hand. Looks like they are only pulling that Raging Bloodhorn. So they're gonna have a little bit less trash on their side. Both of them also using the Bloodlust immediately for this boss pull.
Yeah, and it looks like it's just, again, this is a similar thing to what we saw last week as well. Lots of teams opting to go for different strategies here. We saw a lot of people pull all of the trash with the first boss, and a lot of teams only pull the Bloodhoof with the boss, and looks like we're seeing the same thing here. Although there is a little bit of a difference from Complexity. They're not pulling all the trash mobs. They sapped that one inspired mob in the corner there, so they don't have to worry about kicks on the boss. I wouldn't be surprised to see it just run in here at the end once they've started to deal with the 2 caster mobs. But, okay, they're going to root it and wait for the 2 caster mobs to die so they can interrupt them, and then they'll just cleave it with Dessia, which is a different strategy to what we're used to seeing on live, right? Usually you'll kill Dessia first. Now, the question is, are they going to keep it CC'd to cleave it with something later on, or are they just going to kill it during the RP? Because that would be pretty efficient, too.
Yeah, it takes quite a while until you actually get pulled down. So pulling, they're also all Night Fae as well. That's the beauty of not having that Paladin. That means that everyone in your group can play Night Elf. Well, except, the Rogue and the Hunter who don't need to be Night Elf because they have Feign Death and Vanish. So they can actually do these kind of strategies where they, which probably is something they did maybe in Mists of TIRNA side as well, that maybe I didn't actually just see it happen, because bolstering is one of those affixes where Shadow Melt is so valuable, because if there's a high HP mob, you don't even have to bother about it bolstering. You can just Shadow Melt off the aggro of the bolstered mob at the very end, and then maybe skip them up completely or carry it into the next group or whatever you desire. And you can also do half trash pulls. you can basically kill 2 mobs of a trash pool and then leave the other 2 up by just shadow melting off the aggro. So having that full shadow melt team definitely has some big advantages. Now 4 Danes 1 Swede unfortunately lost one of their players on their boss pool here. They did manage to get that battle rest up on the hunter, and now they are done with their boss as well. The complexity just blasting through that boss, they were done a lot quicker compared to 4 Days and 1 Swede.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is the pull I was talking about. This was what I was worried about. Incinerator plus Portal Guardian. Looks like Complexity had no issues with it whatsoever, so that was probably the scariest pull in the dungeon that I was worried about, other than the Gore Chop wing. But look at this. They're doing the thing that we saw a team do last week that was so confusing. They're going left. Nobody ever goes left, but I guess maybe there's some new tech that makes this a better thing to do rather than just dealing with the 2 interrupt mobs. I wonder what the
maybe they give slightly different percentage.
They definitely
slightly
give
more
different
percent.
count. I don't know if it's more or less though, because honestly,
It would only make sense if they give more, right?
Yeah, that's what I would think.
Yeah, because maybe there's some weird percentage at the very end of the dungeon that you just need like a little bit more percent, and this, you know, is it. That could be it, right? As one more thing to note as well is that Scott is now playing Kyrian, actually. He did play Night Fae in Mists. It's very possible that the only reason he played Night Fae there was because they didn't have any other Night Fae, which is very funny, actually, because Night Fae is, or used to be, a covenant that was everyone literally played that covenant, right? But Fire Up dropping incredibly low as they do it. That is such a dangerous pull because you have that Guardian who is pulsing AoE, and then what's even more dangerous is that Soulbinder. The Soulbinder casts Necrotic Bolts, which, if not interrupted, do a huge amount of damage, as you can see on Fired Up, as he drops incredibly low, but JB managing to keep everyone alive, so now moving on. But then another thing is he also applies this magic debuff that is a dot that ticks for a huge amount of damage, if not dispelled.
I mean, that's about as close as you can get to having someone die but not wiping. And look at this. Not only did they pull that one trash pack up top, but they're also pulling this Shackled Soul pack as well. This is just new routing that we've never seen before. Now, the question is, what are they going to be able to skip later on in the dungeon because they've pulled this? They've probably gotten an extra, like, counting off the top of my head, I think it's like 16 or 18 count from these. And I don't know exactly what they could skip because of that. So, got to keep an eye on their routing, see what they skip later on. Could be a number of different things, so I'm interested to see. I don't think it's enough to let them skip one of the mini bosses in the duelist wing, though. I'm gonna check right now. I'm really curious.
Yeah, 4 Days 1 Swede, on the other hand, though, having some more trouble as their hunter and their tank going down on Varuth here. And Varuth definitely incredibly dangerous to play with this with these affixes because you have Grievous, right? So everyone just taking damage, stacking up those Grievous stacks, and you just can't heal it off because you have a 50% healing reduction, which is crazy, and that's why they were struggling. At first I was thinking, oh my god, why aren't they getting healed out of that Grievous? And then I realized that all of them actually have that 50% healing reduction. Very hard to heal them out of that range then. But yeah, Complexity already up to 37% trash. They're really getting a lot of trash from this area here. As Sarah mentioned, they must be skipping something later on that maybe we haven't seen other teams skip yet. Maybe it has something to do with the Gore Chop pull. They don't want to do a lot in that wing. I'm not sure, but it's definitely interesting because this pull that they're doing right now seems pretty like inefficient, right? Like this seems like it takes forever for like 2 mobs that they do one by one. Interesting.
Well, normally you'd pull those 2 in with the mini boss there, right? But they killed the mini boss so quickly that they just had to kill those 2 on their own. So that was a little bit inefficient, but at the same time, maybe it was just a safety pull because the only way to make that more efficient is to pull all 6 at the same time, but you don't really have picks for all 6 at the same time, so you have to rely on your AoE CC, and that's kind of scary. So they just end up pulling the 2 afterwards. Now, I went into MDT and checked it out just to make sure on live. So they have 10 extra count based off of the normal stuff that you'd normally see. Those 2 bone mages that they skipped on the right side in favor of going left. Killing that top left pack that gave them 2 extra count. And then that 4 pack that they killed after they dealt with the Portal Guardian was an extra 10 count. So they're 12 count up. And the only thing that would make sense to me is maybe they skip like 6 ghosts because of that. But I don't know. Let's keep an eye on what they do here. Are they going to be pulling ghosts with this boss here?
I mean, even Ghosts seems like it would, because they're efficient to kill, right? You can pull them on top of Kulthurak, which
Yeah.
means that it's the most efficient trash you can ever get, unless they would have a hard time actually surviving it, which is very possible considering that it is a 22 and it's Grievous and inspiring too. So you have some of those Shackled Souls, they are inspired, meaning they cannot be interrupted properly. So, but they don't care. As they're pulling those Shackled Souls, you can see some of them are already on there. And you can see just how much damage everyone's taking. Shakib actually going down on that Windwalker. But JB, of course, playing that Rest Druid, has a Battle Rest and can get him back up. Now they're out of rests, though. They have to be very careful to not have anything else happen here. Because there's just so much damage going out in the group.
So actually they got really, really lucky there, but it's not quite over just yet. Lip just dropped incredibly low. Didn't proc the cheat though, so okay. So they got really lucky there. Shaq died like right as his cooldowns were coming up. He didn't pop them just yet. So he still had everything up to kill the ads after he was battle res there. If he had used his cooldowns, they might not have had the damage to deal with those 4 Shackled Souls they pull. And I mean, even though that's happened, they're still pulling more Shackled Souls. They've got the Inspired one up with them now, and they still have one left in the corner there. I'm not sure if they're going to be pulling that, but we'll have to keep an eye on that as well. But this Shackled Soul is going to be alive for a while. They don't have that much damage for it outside of just random dance procs from Shakib. The volley is already on cooldown from fired up, so it's just going to get slowly cleaved down.
And this boss is just so scary with the damage that he's doing by himself with those magic debuffs. And of course, they don't really play a composition where they could dispel 2 of them. They only have JB's magic dispel. Of course, they can use immunities to get rid of that magic debuff, but that's it. They don't have like a master spell from a Shadow Priest or anything like that. So JB has to out-heal that debuff if there's no immunities available. And then on top of that, if the Shackled Souls are there, they're going to be draining the HP off of some players, and if you get unlucky, you might be getting multiple debuffs, multiple damage effects on the same person, and then that's when things happen, like Shakib dying there. Probably exactly what happened, that he just got multiple abilities on him, unfortunately, as they're now dealing with the rest of the Shackled Souls while the boss is already dead. So definitely takes a little while longer to deal with these souls because of the inspiring, right? They didn't pull the inspired mob with any other mobs. It's too dangerous to deal with. So they have to pull the inspired by itself and then pull the other mobs afterwards, which just means that the boss basically dies faster than the souls.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm so curious to see what they're going to do with this extra count. It's like, that's a completely different strategy from what we've normally seen from pretty much any other team. So there must be some reasoning behind it, but gotta keep an eye on this. This is that big pull we were talking about, and one of the changes because of the inspiring is they're not going to go ahead and pull those 3 mobs in the patrol with this crash pack, just to make sure they don't get that inspired mob in. So you can see that one single inspired mob is CC'd off, and the hard's not to worry about it. But even with that all going on, Lips still dropped incredibly low there. Again, didn't proc the cheat, didn't have to use the cloak, so it's going to be a pretty safe looking pull from them. But I mean, a lot can go wrong there, and they made it look easy.
Yeah, that was actually incredibly well done, as they're finishing off the last few mobs here, then dealing with those inspired mobs. Theoretically, they could Shadow Melt off the aggro here again, right, by one of this mob, but doesn't seem like they want to, as Shakib is now also activating that banner. Using Shroud to get past this bridge pack. Yeah, if they can't pull it on top of that pull that they just did, because of the inspired, then I think it makes sense to skip it, because dealing with 3 mobs by itself without being able to pull anything on top, also not one of those like incredibly efficient things you want to do. So they're moving on, actually dealing with this pack. I wonder if there's going to be something they pull on top. This is going to be really dangerous though. Okay, it looks like they did CC the inspired mob. So they're pulling everything except that inspired mob.
Yeah, again, just making sure they single out that mob. It looks like one of the cats went off, but okay. Wow, is Rest Druid OP?
Yep.
He just topped the group instantly. I mean, that kind of moment right there, when we're so used to seeing people drop low like that and like a Holy Paladin not being able to recover, but that's because they're a damage class. Like, yeah, they're low right now, but I'm not going to worry about it because they have a Rest Druid in the group and not a Holy Paladin. He can actually heal the group. Maybe we're just not used to seeing that. Is this the power of healers, I guess, that aren't Holy Paladins? I'm like so confused.
Oh my god,
they
have healing abilities.
So,
yeah, I mean, Rest Druid is definitely Rest Druid is definitely known to be just really good with throughput. I mean, that's all, the problem they always had, Rest Druids, specifically in raids, is that they don't really have any like AoE damage reduction utility that they could be using that like a Holy Paladin provides or a Disc Priest provides, and you know, Shaman has like SLT or Ankh Totem or whatever, and a Rest Druid really doesn't have much like except their pure like throughput. But they also have all of this Druid utility that we haven't even talked about just yet. Druid has such insane utility for M+ specifically, with the Typhoon, Vortex, Roots, Stuns. They have Stealth themselves in case something happens, and that Battle Rust as well, which means they don't have to use the Engineering Rust to get somebody back up. Just so many things they can use to help out the team, which is something that usually we saw the Moonkins provide that kind of utility. But of course, Moonkins just not being very good in an MDI style setting with those speedrunnings. So having that extra utility from the Druid, plus also having that insane heal throughput, really showing here in this TOP, as they're just doing those insane pulls, even though they have Grievous. So GB just, I mean, just doing an insane amount of healing while also doing a really good amount of damage as well.
I mean, we're in the highest key level that we have in the MDI on a fortified setting with Grievous on the Affix pool, right? You would think that one of those casts going off would spell death for, or maybe even a sheet proc for one member of your team. And it looked like Whip did end up procking the sheet on that last pull, but just to see that utility of being able to just top the entire group, that's not really utility. I guess that's just a healing thing, but it's a Druid. It's not a Paladin thing. It's just, it kind of shows what that class is capable of. And I wonder what the actual upper bound is for a Resto Druid in terms of speed. I wonder if it can keep up with the Holy Paladin comps, or if it's like more of a compromise versus safety. Still fast. It can definitely capitalize on a Holy Paladin team that's making mistakes. But I wonder if, like, at the very top end, perfect run-wise, if it's able to compete. And we might be able to see that later this week if they end up playing it against one of the more higher-seeded teams. But it's definitely something interesting to speculate about.
Yeah, I personally think if Complexity thinks that Paladin would just always do more damage, I don't think they would even play the Druid at all, because JB obviously knows how to play Paladin. Of course, he is a Druid main, and he likes his Druid, and whenever a Druid is viable, he's going to be playing it. Oh, yeah. But he wouldn't put down his team if they clearly know that Paladin is better. So I definitely think they think that the Druid damage and the buff that he provides to another damage dealer is basically making up for the damage that the Paladin would do. And then maybe also the utility has some value as well, that passively gives you more damage increase with that extra utility. I definitely think this has something. And I think maybe other teams might be picking this up. Maybe not in like every dungeon, but maybe in some dungeons where the Druid utility is specifically good, I can see this being played more often. But yeah, for Danes in One Swede, unfortunately having some more issues, as this Grievous affix is just really hurting them so much. And again, this is where the Druid comes in. JB not having as much issues at all on the Complexity side, while the Paladin is just really struggling to get everyone out of this Grievous. Unfortunately, a cast just went through though, as they had 2 mini-bosses pulled, and everyone just going down as they're not full HP there.
Man, all right.
Oh, they also pulled Sagadon.
Oh
no.
Yeah, that's just going to be all she wrote for Danes One Swede. They can try to death run it, but I don't think it's going to be the case for them. Now, here's where Complexity might be able to use that extra count. When Harugia goes down, I want to see what their count is at, because they gained, like we were talking about earlier, 12 extra count from the extra trash mobs they pulled versus a normal strat. If you count on the extra ghosts, that means they have 20 extra count on the board, and that means they can just skip the last champion. So you do a little bit of extra AoE, you skip a mini boss mob. That sounds like a pretty good trade-off to me, honestly. I like that.
Well, they also skipped
the captain.
The captain, yeah. The captain, obviously, because it's not only has it the aura, but it's inspired as well. Yeah, we've seen most teams somehow deal with that later on. I think most teams just dealt with it while the boss was spawning, which, to be honest, is decently efficient, right? Because if you have to wait for the last boss to spawn anyway, then you might as well just deal with a captain. But Complexity still has this one inspired mob upstairs that they can kill, which is the 2% that they're missing, right? I would assume so, at least. So they can skip the captain and just deal with that mob they left upstairs. Or did they kill it? Do you remember if they killed it? No, they should have melted it off, right? They still have that mob up there, yeah.
Yeah, they melted it. Yeah, so they melted the captain off for sure, and they
right, so it looks like Complexity is getting lower and lower on staff. Unfortunately, this boss just takes a long time, even if it's not tyrannical, just because it's a 22 key. Xav just notorious for taking forever. And then on top of that, you also just have people being thrown into the arena. You can see in the back that Sokodon is still standing there in the corner. So we've seen a team last weekend pull Sokodon while this boss was happening. And the only way you can avoid it is by positioning yourself at the entrance of this room before you get thrown. So that is something that you have to pay attention to. If someone is standing in the wrong spot as they're getting thrown into the arena, they might be aggroing this Tormentor, and that would be obviously horrible. That would cause a team wipe pretty quickly, because it's almost impossible to deal with the 50% physical damage increase, plus the grip that Sokodon does on top of Xav, who is doing these area of denials.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, with that said, like we talked about earlier right at the end of Zav there, they do have this contender available, and they can just kill it while the boss RP happens again, just efficiently using your time. Otherwise, you would kind of just be sitting here doing nothing, or just running into the wall of minions like we've seen this team do before in the past whenever RP is happening. So yep, we'll finish off that contender. They have the Bloodlust available for the final boss, and as we all know, this boss gets completely nuked when you have large cooldowns available. Let's see how fast they can deal with Mordretha.
Yeah, one more thing to note here is that they have the 3 Tormentor debuffs because they didn't kill the Ruth. So the only debuff that they don't have is the Fire Dot. They have the 50% slow, 50% physical damage increase, and also 50% healing reduction, while also having Grievous. So this is going to be actually pretty difficult to heal for JB if there's any sort of damage coming out. And then you also have a huge amount of damage on Scott, on that Prot Warrior. But thankfully, Spell Reflect actually reflects half of the damage of Mordretha's tank attack. Half of it is physical and half of it is magic. So definitely still a huge amount of damage. As you can see, everyone dropping incredibly low. But huge shield on Scott as well. And it looks like they did have a huge amount of burst here to start, but boss is still on 50%. Just the level really coming in here. The level 22 really just having, like, all the bosses having so much HP.
Yeah, I mean, usually we're used to this being dead by now whenever you have your Bloodlust and cooldowns available, but they're actually going to have to deal with a couple of the mechanics in this phase, and that can be a little scary if you're not baiting things properly here. Wow, I don't think I've ever had to talk about what the proper bait technique is here. Yeah, bait the frontal to the middle, so you have the entire edge to dodge the frontals with, and life is easy, and they're only going to have to deal with one of those. I don't think I've ever had to talk about that on MDI cast before, because the boss is usually dead before that happens.
Yeah, and this boss actually has quite a few mechanics that are interesting. So the fact that this boss always dies so quick is always interesting as a caster. You can't really explain anything. But Complexity actually having so much trouble because of the Deathwalker still being alive there in the corner, just casting death bolts on everybody. But they're just ignoring it as they're just trust JB at keeping the group alive. As they down the boss with only 1 death on the board, they win that first series 2-0.
That's right, Complexity taking the win, and like you said, trust in the Resto Druid, and especially, as you mentioned, 3 of the tormented mobs at the end. You can just see how crazy low everybody got when Mordretha transitioned at 50% there. But hey, great win on the side of Complexity there, and this is what we want to be looking for from our #1 team in this bracket, Dratnos, is the clean execution and how